Welcome to the DRE Way, where we discuss current events, frequently asked questions, and legal matters. When it comes to law, the only way is the DRE Way. Welcome back, everybody. It's a great Wednesday afternoon. We're really grateful to be able to sit down with Darren, Richie again and talk some more legal news and learn a bit more about the legal system. Darren, thanks for being here today.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
Great. So Darren, we wanted to talk about in the news recently in the LA Times, there's been some talk about asset forfeiture. This has come up several times in the last year or so, particularly in regards to the FBI. And I wanted to ask about this because this is something, we've had clients call about this from, having money confiscated at an airport or at a bank, safety deposit boxes. In this last situation, it's armored cars for marijuana dispensaries, that these armored cars are being used essentially like a bank armored car to move money because, these marijuana dispensaries bring in quite a lot of cash. So they want to protect that cash. They want to protect their money. And so they're moving it in cars and they're getting pulled over by, the article names the San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department, but it happens by a lot of people in different situations. So I want to kind of discuss that today and kind of the laws around asset forfeiture.
Sure. Well, that particular case that you're describing really isn't so much an asset forfeiture case as it is a case about the differences between federal and state law and which one reigns supreme upon the other. So, as you know, in California, marijuana is legal even on a recreational basis. And so the facilities that were transporting the money subject of this article were state licensed facilities. And in federal law, it remains illegal. In fact, it's a controlled one substance. Marijuana is not legal in any form and not recognized as legal by the federal government. So the question that gets begged and asked frequently is, well, how can that be? We have a state that says it's legal and we have a federal government that says it's not. From a technical standpoint, there are supremacy laws, which means that the federal government trumps state government laws. And in this case, however, there's a tension that is organic between the two. And typically speaking, the federal government has decided to ignore that tension and look the other way. From again a technical perspective, the FBI could raid all state licensed facilities and shut them down on the basis that they are not compliant with federal law. They're not compliant with the law of America or the United States. However, that doesn't happen because California is a large state, one of the largest states here in this country. It's an important state, and so federal government has typically said, we'll let the state decide, and federal government itself keeps introducing legislation to decide whether or not they want to recognize recreational marijuana as legal. But in this case, there was a tension that was intentionally unavoided, and that was federal agencies seeking and seizing and trying to forfeit a whole bunch of cash that was being transported in these armored cars. Well, think of other companies that deal with a lot of cash. You might consider a 7-Eleven or Circle K to be one of those. Well,
Right.
at any given day in any given city in California, you'll see an armored car come in the morning and come in the evening and take cash away. Well, those are legal businesses. And if, for some reason the federal government decided that one of the items at the 7-Eleven, Snickers candy bar, became illegal, would they be able to pull over the trucks that had the cash that was derived from those sales and take the money? And the answer would be yes, they can, but it would be a hard legal fight. And there are a lot of issues there. And I think that's why ultimately the federal government decided to give the money back and not to continue to pursue it, because you can use any analogy as a hornet's nest or, a can of worms, but this would be a huge issue and it would be legally complex and likely to last for a very long time. So that's probably why they abandoned that forfeiture.
Okay, that certainly makes sense, and it's interesting you mentioned that the federal government has that capacity to go in, because I was always, maybe this is my lack of education or my not paying attention in civics class, but that is something I don't really understand, is where the difference between federal and state laws work, because I thought I was taught that state laws generally supersede the federal, but that you're telling me that's the opposite.
Well, that's why you probably should move away from Utah or those schools wherever you were educated, because that's not the case. The federal government reigns supreme, and it's
Okay,
under a law that is always known as supremacy.
got
And
it.
the supreme law of the land is the federal law, not the state law.
Okay, so it is interesting that
Let me
there's a lot.
sorry to interrupt you. Sorry to interrupt you. I just want to give
Yeah,
you an example. This is why state licensed facilities are having a real hard time dealing with issues like paying taxes. How do you pay federal taxes on illegal contraband that's not recognized federally, but it's recognized in California? And further, their banking system. There's no infrastructure by which the state licensed cannabis facilities can really utilize any banks that are backed by Federal Deposit Insurance Company, keyword there being federal, FDIC. And
got
those
it.
federal banks don't want cannabis money. So there's a large issue here that's looming for how to get this illegal business in a place where it can operate as if it were legal and not have to operate behind closed doors when the laws of the land in this state let it be conducted in an open environment and freely. So that's the issue there. Go ahead,
Okay.
though.
No, and so you mentioned a good point there, which is that because that's probably where this company that's mentioned in this article, Imperial, which is out of Pennsylvania, but obviously they're providing these services in all kinds of different states. The reason they essentially exist is because the FDIC and the banks don't want to handle this type of money. So they have to move around large amounts of cash because that's really the only way they do business, because there's not these systems in place to actually handle this type of a enterprise.
Yeah, and I know it's not the subject of this particular podcast, but these complexities are causing a real burden on the owners of these facilities. They're incurring a ton of costs in terms of tax and a ton
Mm-hmm.
of costs in terms of trying to seek an infrastructure that, mimics the reality of the guy next door that's conducting legal, lawful business. Whereas the folks that are disobeying the laws here in California and selling marijuana illegally, by procuring it from sources that grew it illegally and distribute it illegally, manufacture it illegally, they are tending to fare better. They are acquiring their goods at a lower cost and selling them at more profit as a result. And so this is a big problem, and it's going to have to be recalibrated and recontracted in order for it to succeed.
Yeah, and not to get a little bit further off topic on that tangent, but this is something I thought about a little bit. When we have these type of legal situations and these lawsuits done to, these can sometimes, like, as lawyers, you guys work within the laws that exist, but sometimes these cases you guys work can actually inform the laws that get formed, correct?
And that does happen with regard to precedent, and that's what you hear about when you always read about the Supreme Court. There's many courts. There's a trial court, an appellate court, a state appeals court, and then ultimately the Supreme Court. These courts try to interpret laws. And when they take a set of facts and then make a ruling after applying the law to those facts, that in a way is an interpretation of the law. And if the legislature reviews it and realizes, oh, maybe we need to reword the law, sometimes they can go in and change the law as a result. Otherwise, the holding of the court becomes the law of the land because it's the interpretation.
Okay, that makes sense. So, getting back to kind of these asset seizures, asset forfeitures, this seems to have been kind of a very common thing. We had one just down the block from our Beverly Hills location, that was actually mentioned in the article as well, that happened last year, where the FBI raided tens of millions of dollars in valuables from safe deposit boxes. Uh, they ended up not being able to produce evidence of criminal wrongdoing. They weren't able to show, like, yeah, we seized this because there was criminal activity. How does that, like, do they really have the right to just come in and seize stuff without the proof, or how does that work?
That's probably a whole other subject, and it deals a lot with probable cause. And I know that case.
Okay,
That case was essentially a private mailbox facility and secured box facility. And I believe that some of the indictments stuck, like, for example, against the owners of the facility, but not the owners of all the boxes, because where some probable cause of criminal activity may have existed for some of the individuals who own some of the boxes inside, it didn't give the government carte blanche access to all of the boxes. So,
got it.
because probable cause wasn't assigned per box, they didn't have the right and therefore had to give back a lot of the money that was seized. There's a difference between seizure and forfeit. Seizure is just the physical act of taking the money. But forfeiture now becomes not a criminal issue, it's a civil issue. And that means that they're going to keep the money and you're never getting it back. Those are two separate phases. To seize the money, there must be probable cause to begin with. And then in order to keep the money, there's different constructs depending on what state you're in and whether you're dealing with state law or federal law. I'll go over that just real briefly since we only
Sure.
have a couple minutes left. But in state law, if money was seized that's under $40,000, then the only way that they can keep it moving from seizure to forfeiture is that the individual who they seized it from sustained an actual criminal conviction related to that money. So if they got pulled over and there were drugs and there was a drug transaction that was evidenced and proved, and they took, $28,000 as a seizure, they'd be able to keep it if the individual actually was found guilty of that crime. If it's over $40,000, and by the way, when I talk about monetary value, it's not just the money, but it can be any property that's valued at that type of money, like a boat, an airplane, or
Planes. Yeah.
if it's over $40,000, then they have to prove by clear and convincing evidence that the money was related to the crime. You don't actually have to have the conviction on the underlying conduct, but they have to prove by clear and convincing evidence that the two were connected. And then that gets into burdens of proof, which should be the subject of another discussion. But beyond reasonable doubt is the highest level of burden of proof. Clear and convincing is right below that. But switching the subject now to federal law only has to prove by a preponderance of the evidence that there was criminal activity and the result of the money was derived from that criminal activity and connected to that criminal activity, substantially connected to that criminal activity. But the
Okay.
burden of proof is beyond a reasonable doubt is here, clear and convincing is here, and preponderance of the evidence is down here. So depending on what agency pursues you and indicts you, you have a different way to get your money back.
That is very helpful actually, and that's interesting that there's such a lower level of proof required for federal level to be able to hold it. You would think in an idea of having a fair society that it would be even across the board, but it's interesting that it's not. I do really appreciate your time, Darren, to go through this. I know we had just very brief time on it, but it's very interesting to learn some of this stuff. I think it was very helpful for me personally, and I hope our audience really enjoys this. If you guys have any questions, you are more than welcome to submit comments down below in the YouTube. Any questions you want Darren to answer that are legal questions, we can probably do a Q&A here pretty soon. That would be kind of a fun one to do as well. And we'll get into burden of proof and some of those other ones in future episodes. So Darren, I really thank you for your time. I know you're extremely busy and we appreciate you taking the time to do these podcasts and help educate people.
My pleasure. See you next time.
See you next Wednesday.